Good afternoon and welcome to the Niskanen Center briefing on drug patents and COVID-19. I'm Kodiak Davis, Director of Government Affairs at Niskanen, and I'll be the moderator for today's discussion. For those of you who may be unfamiliar with Niskanen, we're a 5-year-old think tank based in Washington, D.C. And while we are nonpartisan, our policy work promotes market-based solutions and the principles of an open society. A quick reminder before we get started that there's a Q&A feature at the bottom of your screen. We welcome all participants to submit questions throughout the conversation, and then we'll answer those at the end. It's my pleasure to introduce today's panelists, Brink Lindsey and Daniel Takash. Brink is a vice president at Niskanen, where he focuses on slow growth and high inequality. A published author many times over, his work has often been featured in the Washington Post. Daniel is a regulatory policy fellow at Niskanen, where he focuses on intellectual property and systems of regressive rent seeking. His work has been featured in the Hill and Morning Consult. Without further ado, I'll turn it over to Brink to get the conversation started.
Thanks, Kodiak, and thanks to everybody for joining us today. I'm going to kick off with sort of a big picture view on patents in general and Niskanen's approach to patent policy, segue into drug patents in particular, and then turn the ball over to Daniel, who will address the issues of patents and pharmaceuticals, especially with respect to the current pandemic, in much more detail. I got into the issue of patents and copyrights, so-called intellectual property, in the context of a much broader interest in problems of rent seeking and regulatory capture. Those are fancy economist terms for when narrow interests dominate rulemaking in a way to twist the rules of the game to benefit themselves at the expense of everybody else. So it had been my suspicion that patents and copyrights fell into this problematic bucket. Patents and copyrights are typically described as striking a delicate balance between producer and consumer interests in earning a return on their innovations and creative output, consumer interests in access and low prices. It had been my sense that that delicate balance was out of whack in a way that was favoring copyright and patent interests at the expense of everybody else. Oh boy, once I dove into the research, that sense was confirmed many times over. I think in both areas, over the past few decades, policy has spiraled badly out of control, and in a way that is not only bad for consumers, but it's bad for innovators as well, because in particular patents create a kind of legal minefield that downstream innovators have to wade through. I also discovered in doing this research that one of the big reasons why patent and copyright law are so out of whack is the terrific marketing coup of labeling them intellectual property. I think that if we see these policies as property, as protection for kind of expansive and open-ended rights, then we're going to think that the more aggressive the enforcement, the wider the scope of the enforcement, the better property rights are being protected, and that gives us a sense that we're on the right track to doing pro-market things. If, however, you don't see it that way, you see patents and copyrights more like a tax or a monopoly or just a regulatory scheme that should be construed narrowly, not to impinge unnecessarily on others' economic freedom, then you're going to have a very different approach to thinking about these laws and thinking about expanding them and thinking about expanding ever more draconian ways of enforcing them. We addressed the issue of whether patents and copyrights qualify as property or should be thought of as property a bit in the book, but didn't have space to develop those arguments in sufficient detail. So last year, Daniel and I co-authored a white paper for Niskanen called Why Intellectual Property is a Misnomer, and went through the arguments which we have determined are quite weak. First of all, so on the one hand, patents create a system of rights to something of value, and those rights are transferable. So that is, in a kind of just purely positive sense, can be seen as a system of property rights. You've got legal rights to stuff, and you can sell it and buy it, and that sounds like property. But then you can do the same thing with taxi cab medallions. They are something of value that are transferable, but we don't tend to think of taxi cab medallions, which are simply the mechanism through which monopoly privileges for taxi cab riding are created. We don't think of that as something as sort of essentially the same as private property and land or movable property. And like taxi cab medallions, the first thing that jumps out at you about patents and copyrights, as opposed to normal property rights and physical objects, is that they create scarcity rather than allocating it. So property rights are an emergent solution to an unavoidable problem, which is that stuff is rivalrous. That is, if one person is eating a hamburger, the other person can't. If one person is dribbling a basketball, the other person can't. One person is driving a car, nobody else can. So physical stuff, it's one person at a time. And if one person is owning something, and which means exerting control over its use and disposition, nobody else can. When you've got a bunch of rivalrous stuff out there in the world, there's inevitably going to be conflicts over who gets to control it. So who has property rights over what? And if those disputes are not adjudicated, then you're quickly into the Hobbesian war of all against all. And so private property evolved as a mechanism for allocating scarcity in a way that has great advantages because it gives incentives to the property owner to make valuable use of that property because she benefits when the property is put to valuable use. Also gives strong incentives to property owners to conserve their property because they are the ones who take the hit if the property is destroyed. So we have this system for allocating scarcity in physical stuff, but ideas are a different thing altogether. One symphony orchestra playing Beethoven's Symphony No. 9 does not in any way make it less possible for other symphony orchestras to play that wonderful symphony. If I read a book, it doesn't stop you from reading and enjoying the same thing. As Thomas Jefferson said, ideas are like candlelight. I can move my candle over to you and light your candle without losing the illumination from mine. In fact, a system of so-called property rights in ideal goods or in ideas achieves precisely the opposite thing that property in physical goods does. It creates scarcity out of nowhere, much like taxi cab medallions, or like the old robber barons of the Rhine River. If you've ever taken a cruise down the Rhine, you notice every mile or so there's this beautiful picturesque castle up perched on a hill. It's just lovely. The problem in reality back in the old days is every one of those castles belonged to some lord who would drag a chain across the river to stop past boats and hold them up for tolls. So traffic down the Rhine was incredibly congested and expensive because of basically legalized holdups every mile or so by feudal lords who had created property rights in the river by creating artificial scarcity where none had existed before. And likewise, patents create a holdup where people who want to use an idea that's out there have to pay in order to use it. Now, there are justifications for this creation of scarcity that could justify the enterprise and make it look like another kind of property rights, but we don't think they work. So first of all, there's just the kind of moral claim derived from an extrapolation of John Locke's idea of homesteading private property. John Locke had the idea that private property could arise without plunder or theft simply by people living in a state of nature that is a state of unowned property and making physical improvements in that property, mixing their labor with the world, and thereby creating rights over the part of planet Earth that they had physically improved. And so by that mechanism, you could have a kind of immaculate conception for property rights where they emerge without anybody stealing anything from anybody, and then were transferred over time through free exchange and contract. So the idea then is that the person who improves the property and mixes her labor with it deserves it, and that has a great deal of intuitive appeal and makes sense. So patent lobbies try to apply this Lockean idea to patents, that you made up this idea, so it belongs to you. And that sounds plausible. The problem is putting it into practice immediately plunges you into all kinds of absurd hypotheticals. If you note just a free-floating right to own all your ideas, then where do you draw the line? Scientific discoveries, those are ideas too. We could have the Einstein family collecting royalties every time anybody's doing any sort of using cell phones that use GPS that derive from the theory of relativity, et cetera. We don't do that. We think it would be crazy to have people own scientific truth. But patents are really ultimately patents of knowledge. You know that if you employ technique X, useful effect Y is generated. So really patents are a kind of ownership of knowledge. They extend now into beyond just devices, into techniques and incorporeal know-how. So if there's some sort of free-floating ownership of ideas, and then if you own stuff, you own it forever. Would you own ideas forever? No, we think we should put limits on it. So immediately, once you're in this, once you're trying to think through how you go from the idea that if you made up an idea, you own it, to building a legal regime, just to make it even remotely practicable, you have to start throwing in all kinds of exceptions, which you don't have to do for physical property, and which then make you think, well, why don't you just start off thinking this is a regulatory policy to begin with, where costs and benefits have to match each other, or where the benefits have to be more than the costs. The other sort of economists' utilitarian or consequentialist justification for thinking of patents as property rights is that, like private property and physical goods, property in ideas helps to internalize externalities. So that is, when we own, as I mentioned before, the owner of private owner of physical stuff has incentives to take care of that property, because the costs and benefits of using that property are internalized to the owner. So when the decision maker over how to use something has benefits from the upside and is exposed to the downside, that person has good incentives to make good use of the stuff. So the problem with the applying this to the world of ideas, there is the argument that if you produce an invention and other people can just copy it freely, then you are basically conferring an external benefit on the outside world that you're not getting to internalize. So you came up with this innovation, but other people who didn't spend a minute trying to think of how to invent this wonderful new gizmo now reverse engineer it and copy it. They're benefiting from your work. And so therefore, if you're not profiting from your innovation, or if other people are able to profit from your innovation and you're not, then your incentives to innovate are compromised. So the argument for patents and copyright is that there's a kind of market failure, that due to the ease of copying, innovators will not have sufficient incentive to produce valuable new ideas because the returns will all go to copycats. Now, this is a valid argument. It's a plausible argument. It offers a justification for a certain level of patent protection, but it has real limitations, and limitations that are systematically ignored by patent lobbies. In particular, you don't have to capture all the returns of an innovation to have sufficient incentive to innovate. Indeed, the economist William Nordhaus from Yale did a wonderful paper estimating what percentage of the social returns from innovation are actually captured by the entrepreneurs that make them. And he determined through clever methodology, and the nature of a market economy to have huge external benefits in the form of innovation. And we can have robust incentives for innovation, and clearly a world transformed by technological progress, even when entrepreneurs and innovators only capture a small share of the total gains produced. So the point isn't that innovators need to capture all or the lion's share of returns. It's just they need to capture enough. So when you think about it that way, you realize that simply just that you can no longer assume that wider scope for patents and more enforcement for patents is automatically better incentives for innovation. It could indeed be quite the opposite. That even if particular innovators are benefited greatly by getting windfall gains from their innovations, downstream innovators who need that technology, need access to that technology to produce the next step in technological progress, are going to be deterred by the monopoly control of the upstream ideas. So the two justifications, the kind of moral desert justification and the consequentialist internalized externalities justification, don't really add up to allowing us or justifying our thinking of patents as a kind of private property. Better to think of them as a sort of a tax imposed by producers themselves. Consumers have to pay extra because of the temporary monopoly privileges that the product under patent enjoys. You can think of them as a monopoly, and that's very straightforward. For 20 years, under a patent law, the patentee enjoys exclusive rights to produce that good. So that's a monopoly privilege. Or you can just think of it as a regulatory scheme that we have all kinds of regulations to try to align private profit seeking with the public interest, and this is one to try to goose up the returns from innovation and therefore to produce more innovation. But when we think of it in any of these ways, then we're much less likely to believe just automatically that more is better. When we switch over to thinking specifically about drug patents, here is an area where, at least in theory, the case for strong patent protection is rock solid. In general, the case for exclusive rights or patents is strongest when the costs of innovation are very high. That is, not being able to earn a return is going to be a big deterrent because the upfront costs are so high. And also the costs of imitation are very low. So sometimes it's easy to knock off something that somebody else has produced before. Sometimes it's really hard. One just interesting sidelight, recipes for food are not patented. And so you see all kinds of world famous chefs producing recipe books and selling them, selling their secrets for how they make their amazing dishes. And yet we don't think that they're foolish or giving away the store. They found another way to profit from not only do they sell meals at the restaurant, but they sell cookbooks. And they can do that because just following the recipe in the cookbook doesn't make you a master chef. Actually imitating what the master chef has created ain't easy. And so the costs of imitation are high. So in that case, there is a kind of a natural barrier that protects the innovator from imitation and competition. So, but in drugs, upfront development costs are in the billions of dollars. So costs of innovation are very high. Costs of imitation are relatively low. That is, the costs of figuring out how to produce a generic equivalent is a tiny fraction of developing the drug in the first place. And furthermore, the boundaries between patented products are very clear. If you're going to have a system of so-called intellectual property, one of the big problems with it is that the boundaries between the items of property are frequently vague, especially in the case of software patents, where the scope of the patent is defined in very vague and abstract language, and you don't really know what the patent covers until you litigate it. But in the case of drug patents, the boundaries of the so-called intellectual property are delineated by chemical formulas. It's very easy to search them and figure out if your new product is infringing or not. All in all, the drug patent system is sort of the theoretical poster child for the use of patents. And yet, in the current day, we're seeing a lot of gaming of the system and abuse of the system. Just to back up, in general, before talking about drugs, in general, there has been an explosion in patenting in the United States. So the US Patent and Trademark Office now gives out about 5 times as many patents every year as it did back in the early 80s. We are not seeing a corresponding 5-fold increase in productivity growth. So if you thought that more patenting, the more innovation, that should be one quick clue that you should think again. So this enormous increase in patenting is not because of an enormous acceleration in innovation. It's because we have expanded the scope of what is patentable, so that now software and business methods are patentable where before they were not. And we've also generally reduced the standards for patentability across the board, so that it's just a lot easier to get a patent. In the drug space, the potential for abusing the system comes from these low standards of patentability, that you are able to get patents on tiny incremental improvements. So if you've produced a drug and its patent is about to run out, and the old drug, you had to take it 4 pills a day. If you've now figured out a way to take 1 pill that's a 24-hour dose, you can get a new patent on that and extend your patent life for that. Insulin, which was developed many, many decades ago, is extremely expensive in the United States because some of the delivery mechanisms for it are patented. So drug makers produce these patent walls. They patent every little component of the, not only the drug itself, but of the drug making process. And then they will introduce tiny and therapeutically irrelevant innovations to extend patent lives by patenting those tiny innovations. So as a result of that, there's an outfit that's interested in patent reform called IMAC. They looked at the 12 top selling drugs in the United States. Each of them had an average of 125 patents filed on them per drug, with an average of 38 years of claimed patent protection, as opposed to the statutory maximum of 20 years. So that's a clue as to the kind of monkey business that's going on. If you want just a real vivid image of system gone haywire, think about Theranos, the scam launched for the little finger stick blood tests that didn't work. Theranos had hundreds of patents on a lie. So without any actual product that could actually do any good, they had a whole host of products, some of which were asserted in a way in an effort to slow down the development of COVID tests, but asserted unsuccessfully, thankfully. So even in an area where the theoretical case for patenting is very strong, we see widespread abuse. Taking this vantage point that Niskanen brings to these issues and applying them specifically to the details of patent policy in the age of the coronavirus pandemic, I'm going to turn things over to my colleague, Daniel Takash.
Thank you very much, Brink, and thank you, Kodiak, for moderating, and thank you, everyone, excuse me, for joining us. Yeah, so building off of what Brink said in his last point with respect to the number of patents you'll see on top-selling drugs and the fact that we see patents on things that don't exist. We got rid of the prototyping requirement for patenting in the late 19th century. I think it's important to discuss the fact that there's sort of a Schoolhouse Rock view of the patent system where some inventor comes up with something out of nothing. They go to the patent office, they get the patent, and they get their 20 years of exclusivity. If it's a drug, the FDA does its thing, and that can eat into it a little bit, but then you get the innovation and then expires. And that just isn't the case. The phenomenon Brink referred to, where you have so many patents layered on top of a drug, often for incremental changes that offer no real therapeutic benefit. That's a practice, called patent thickening. It's under the broader term of evergreening. So it complicates the sort of general narrative that's advanced. But To move more specifically to drug patenting and the issues exposed by the pandemic, my colleague Jamie Love at Knowledge Ecology International has a good joke where patents or where drugs are the best and worst case for the patent system. As Brink says, the costs of innovation are extremely high, not just in what it takes to actually develop a drug and bring it to market, but also in the risk that there is a failure. What if this drug turns out to be ineffective or actively dangerous? Well, that's a whole lot of money that perhaps won't go to total waste, because we now know another way to not make a light bulb, to borrow from Thomas Edison. But that's a lot of money that's been spent that can't go to its intended use. And it's relatively easy to reverse engineer these things, and drugs produced at marginal cost or close to marginal cost can be extremely cheap. There's one study examining candidates for coronavirus that came out a couple months ago, back when remdesivir was the leading candidate, that found that an effective treatment over the course of about a month could be done for about $1 a day. This is extremely cheap, but that, producing at marginal cost doesn't factor in all the upfront costs of innovation. So that's why drugs are the best candidate for the patent system. But they're also the worst candidate for the patent system, because you see abuses of monopoly power. You see drug prices that are sky high, where you don't see that's even necessarily associated with the research and development costs. It's just charging whatever the market will bear, since a significant sum of that money comes from Medicare spending. Something in the neighborhood of 1/6 of Medicare spending goes to drugs, and the lion's share of that money goes to drugs that are on patent. You see drug prices fall off a cliff. Once something goes generic. You also see instances where the government invests a significant amount of money into the development of drugs, and that's where the Schoolhouse Rock narrative also comes into trouble. You think they just, it starts out of Merck or wherever from nothing, but there's a significant amount of funding that goes into it. There was one study that came out a few years ago that found from 2010 to 2016, all of the new molecular entities were associated with some type of government-funded research. Now, in that specific study, the term associated with is doing a lot of work that is in some way tangentially related, and that's an important point to bring up. Some folks who are a little bit more left of center and have an axe to grind with the pharmaceutical system will frame the industry as purely parasitic, profiting exclusively off of government funding. And that isn't quite true. It's more the fact that there is an efficient division of labor between government research and private sector pharmaceutical R&D, where the government has the resources and the incentives to invest in relatively basic research that may not turn out to be anything, that pharmaceutical firms just can't be expected to take the risks on. But once the underlying principles have been discovered, and a lot of that research can be done, then the private sector can take these findings and then go and run with it. So it's not necessarily anti-pharma, it's just that the narrative is complicated and there's a division of labor. However, considering the investment that has already been made by institutions, namely the NIH, BARDA gave a Johnson & Johnson subsidiary around $500 million in order to develop a coronavirus vaccine, it only makes sense that there should be some strings attached associated with ensuring that the government, or rather the taxpayers who finance the government, should get a reasonable return. And that includes certain safeguards to prevent excessive pricing, or safeguards to ensure that if someone retains an exclusivity right, they are able to produce a sufficient number of these drugs. And that's where you get into sections of the law, such as the march-in rights under the Bayh-Dole Act, where if you have a patented innovation that was developed in part with government funding, the government has the right to exercise march-in rights, where they can force you to license under a reasonable term. That has been severely underutilized in the past, and I think we should examine possibilities to better enforce it. Bayh-Dole does not explicitly contain measures about pricing, like the final product pricing, but in scenarios where we could easily see a shortage of vaccines or treatments simply because there is only so much that any one company can produce, to address that, Bayh-Dole could be an effective measure depending on what turns out to be the effective treatment. The other provision that is significantly more aggressive than Bayh-Dole in its scope is Title 28, Section 1498. It's just called 1498 for shorthand, where it gives the government the ability to use whatever patent it wants, as long as they provide a reasonable term. This is a much more wide-ranging measure, and it could have the ability to ensure that it is priced in a reasonable way if the government decided to license it out to private firms. One of my favorite examples about where 1498 was not invoked, but it was threatened, was immediately following 9/11. Everyone was terrified of anthrax, and the Bush administration wanted to produce a significant stockpile of Cipro, which was a treatment for anthrax poisoning. At the time, Bayer was charging an excessive price for it, and so the Bush administration, though they did not go through with it, threatened to say, hey, we have 1498, we could simply use the patent, and Bayer lowered the price. So those are our examples where government can sort of protect its return on investment, not only in cases where it has actually spent money in order to develop these treatments, these patented inventions, whatever, but also to ensure that a regulatory privilege designed to promote innovation doesn't turn into excess, and where we can ensure that a reasonable return doesn't turn into a sky high rent. Which is the main issue when you're talking about drug patents. And then a final note, we'll turn over to Kodiak to see if there's Q&A, is that in this scenario, in a COVID scenario, we've actually seen the logic of the patent system turned on its head. Previously, we've talked about problems with the patent system and tools we can have to make sure prices don't get particularly excessive or anything like that. But in the case of emerging infectious diseases, we didn't know that this specific virus would be the one out there, would be the one that had to be treated. So it's unreasonable to expect a pharmaceutical company to invest in every possible virus under the sun that may or may not turn into a pandemic. There was a study that was done where, looking back, emerging infectious diseases had a negative return on investment. And so that is a case where the government really needs to pick up the slack and provide the R&D financing that you wouldn't expect the private sector to do. But coming with that, there should be reasonable restrictions on the ability to use patent rights, either compulsory licensing or government owning the patent and making it free for all to use. So there are issues with excessive pricing, and in this particular context, the patent system doesn't make particular sense. And if we are treating the patent system as any other type of regulatory privilege, government intervention, it should be treated as just one tool in the toolbox, and we should look to other solutions to promote innovation that don't necessarily come with the downsides of the patent system discussed.
Well, thank you to Daniel and Brink. Certainly, this is a complex area, and I think it's also a very timely area. We've been hearing a lot about this, and a lot of different, feels like every couple of weeks there's a different press release about, a new drug that looks like it could be a cure, at least a successful treatment for COVID. So it's certainly top of mind and very topical. One question that comes to mind is that there are a lot of terms that came up during this conversation, things like patent thicketing and evergreening. It's a very complex field. How do you, in unpacking some of the challenges presented by the kind of schoolhouse rock myth of patent, how do you dismantle that when the other side feels so simplistic and what you're talking about is so complex? What are some of the challenges you've had in explaining these issues and how you work around that?
I'll just say something and Daniel can add. So again, I think the biggest barrier, especially in discussing this with Republican free market oriented people, is this idea that patents are intellectual property. And so that immediately puts patent holders on this fantastic moral high ground. We're not asking for handouts or special favors. We just want you to protect us against thieves and pirates. So intellectual property theft, intellectual property piracy. So on one side is private property and capitalism, the system of private property rights. On the other side are thieves, pirates, and communists who want common property over ideas. So the rhetoric is just fantastically advantageous for expansion of monopoly privileges under patent law in the name of protecting property rights. So going through that and so showing things, there's vivid examples of how things just aren't how they should be. So if indeed patents are the key to innovation, then how have we had a productivity growth slump during a multi-decade period where the number of patents issued has gone up fivefold? If patenting is to protect actual inventions that make the world better, how did Theranos get hundreds of them on a scam? It's not easy because the rhetorical fog is very, very thick. But sort of patient use of examples and showing how if what you're thinking is true, the world would look very different in this or that or the other respect, can slowly shake the scales off people's eyes as it was off mine and Daniel's over time.
Yeah, that's an excellent point. There is sort of a mental block that can be associated with the treatment of property. And because if you are interfering with free trade, free exchange, and particularly property rights, especially for those on the more right-leaning end of the spectrum, you need a good reason, or for some folks, in some cases, a really good reason in order to infringe on those property rights. So if you can bring it back down to, as I said, just one more way that we promote innovation in the country, no different morally than a subsidy or other period or other form of exclusivity. That is a good way to sort of knock it off an undeserved moral high ground. But you still run into the policy issues. They say, well, wouldn't there just be issues of free riding, which are 100%, which are completely valid. And something that needs to be contended with on a case-by-case basis. So if you're designing the electric motor for a bicycle or something like that, patent system works fine. We should probably increase the time given to examiners and hire more patent examiners, because there are some welfare losses when you have an average of 19 hours to examine a given patent. But in general, those instances are fine. In the case of drugs specifically, though, you need to do two things. Number one, you need to point to an alternative. Okay, pharma invests X billion dollars in drug development, expecting a certain return. There is no reason why, if the return on investment is the thing you are concerned with, the government couldn't simply pick up the slack. As we said, BARDA has provided grants. The NIH provides grants to a number of institutions, nonprofit academic institutions, but also private sector institutions. So there's no particular reason that specific gap cannot be filled. It's also important to point out how the logic of the patent system in these specific cases, when there's a negative return, well, no innovation will occur at a time where perhaps we would need it. So there are specific shortcomings of approaching that issue. And then finally, you can look and say, well, when does a reasonable return on investment turn into a rent, which is excessive? And you can look at the financial situation of pharmaceutical firms. The large pharmaceutical manufacturers perform other industries in terms of their returns by several percentage points. There was one study that found that large pharmaceutical manufacturers could lose $1 trillion in revenue and still remain one of the most profitable industries in the United States. So it's the removal of the moral high ground and treating it as just one of many tools to promote innovation, discussing how the problems posed by free riding can be resolved through other opportunities in the toolkits, how reliance on the patent system doesn't make sense in a number of contexts, and pointing out that we need to promote innovation, but perhaps the current system is just providing gravy to an industry above and beyond what they would need to bring a given innovation to market.
We're absolutely right. I think the rhetoric of property rights is really hard to overcome, and I'm really grateful that you are both working on this because it's clear that we have a lot of important work still to be done. So Daniel, you mentioned during your remarks something called march-in rights, and I'm unfamiliar with that principle or what it means, how that works. Could you walk me through that?
Sure. So march-in rights are part of the compromise or part of the Bayh-Dole Act, which is currently celebrating its 40th anniversary. The Bayh-Dole Act systematized the ability of folks working for government contractors to receive patent rights in innovations developed with, excuse me, government funding. And a safeguard that was included in Bayh-Dole are what's called march-in rights. They're in Section 203 of the Patent Act, if I recall. And basically what it says is that under certain circumstances, should you fail to bring it to practical application, or should terms that were entered into not be met, the relevant agency, often the NIH when we're talking about drug patents, has the ability to go in and issue compulsory licenses so that anyone can use the patent. The problem is Bayh-Dole has been severely underutilized, and there's, we're celebrating the 40th anniversary of Bayh-Dole, and everyone is saying Bayh-Dole was this great thing, except the march-in provision, which we shouldn't use. And so, as I said, Bayh-Dole doesn't deal directly with the price of drugs, or it applies broadly to patents, so the price of the ultimate patented product. So that's not quite relevant if we're concerned about the drug prices. But more important is that we need to make sure that there are enough vaccines, treatments, whatever, just out there. So it is a much more useful tool to address a simple shortage. There just aren't enough firms manufacturing it. And so we need to start issuing licensing using that power.
Thank you. That certainly clarifies my question.
If I could just jump in and add one. So especially when we're talking about infectious diseases, the issue of affordability and of ramping up production quickly takes on a whole new urgency. So normally with drugs, we're used to an externality on the producer side. That is that they're not able to capture all the benefits of their innovation because of copycatting. And so we have this problem that can be addressed through patenting. Here we have an externality on the demand side. Everyone who takes a COVID vaccine not only helps himself, but he helps everybody else too by getting us that much closer to herd immunity. So, so there is a huge social interest in the rapid dissemination, rapid production, and wide distribution, regardless of the ability to pay, of these drugs. And so, especially in the infectious disease format, you're likely to see more reasons for more government involvement simply because the normal method of distribution based on ability to pay just isn't going to cut it when you're talking about a highly infectious disease.
Thank you, Brink. And I thought it was fascinating. I can't recall if it was you or Daniel who made reference to the fact that just because they're infectious emerging diseases doesn't necessarily mean that those are real profit centers, and they're often overlooked. So the government really does have a very specific role to play in kind of incentivizing that research and innovation. Okay, our next question is, and this is complex, so I'll read it slowly. What do you make of Gilead's action to donate a large supply of remdesivir? Honestly, learning how to say all these words is a challenge in and of itself. Is this just trying to buy goodwill? How much is there a role for public pressure and reform versus actual regulatory changes? And I think this question also gets at the public perception right now, which is definitely a huge part of this conversation.
Yeah, so I can't, speak for Gilead. So perhaps there's some goodwill, just genuine human kindness associated with it. I'd like to think so. But I think there is also a PR, to take a more cynical view, a PR benefit for it. So in the case of Gilead specifically, early on in the pandemic, they applied for orphan drug status, which is similar to, but separate from, technically speaking, the patent system, where you can get an extra 7 years of exclusivity for drugs for which there are, I believe the threshold is 200,000 patients or fewer. Now, at the time for COVID-19, that was true. But obviously it's difficult. I'm having trouble saying with a straight face that this would be a rare disease. This is going to spread tremendously. There was a huge outcry. Folks everywhere, including our friends at Public Citizen, sent all sorts of letters. They eventually withdrew their application. So there are some moves like that. Perhaps Gilead is attempting to cover its tracks. But with respect to broader public perception of the pharmaceutical industry, it was one of, I believe, if not the most unpopular industry in the United States. A lot of that has to do with lingering resentment, some justified, over the opioid crisis. But at the end of the day, every time you refill your prescription, if it's not a generic, you're feeling the price of it. So I think a lot of it has to do with perhaps buying cover, or again, genuine goodwill and a desire to resolve the crisis, so that the patent protection they receive would perhaps, if not go overlook, then the harms of it being played down because they aren't using the system to the fullest extent that they could.
Just to jump in, to kind of point out that all is not doom and gloom with regard to the drug policy space. One triumph of U.S. drug policy has been the robustly growing market for generics. So once drugs are off patent, then generic producers can enter the market freely, and we have done a pretty good job of making the policy environment favorable for generic introduction, such that now the lion's share of drugs prescribed in the United States are generics, and those generics sell at a really steep discount, something like 80% to patented prices. So when you look at overall sort of drug pricing in America, you have a mixed story. You have a great story of plunging prices because of growing generic market share, and then you have drugs under patent where it seems like the gamesmanship and abuses are getting worse and worse over time. So you have these pockets of things that drive people crazy in the midst of a story where many times things are going pretty well. Then on top of the patent, strictly patent issue, there are a whole bunch of regulatory hurdles you have to jump through to get approval for generics. And so if you remember the mess about Martin Shkreli and that AIDS drug that he jacked the price of through the roof. He was exploiting FDA regulations of generics, which make it very difficult. So he was going to be in the position of having a temporary monopoly because no one else was going to produce this very old off-patent drug, and he was able to jack up the price many-fold. So just to kind of round out the picture, there's a lot of parts of the drug market that are going great, and there's other things going wrong besides patent policy.
Well, thank you both for unpacking that a little bit. The final part of that question, I just want to make sure that this is highlighted and you get a chance to speak to this, because I really do think that this was kind of the crux of first Brink giving the kind of overall landscape, and then Daniel getting into more specificity. What is the role for public pressure in actually reforming some of these systems? I think, mentioning the famous case with Martin Shkreli, that name is well known. I think there are some instances that are pretty well known in the public sphere about prices going way up, increasing 100-fold. So what is the role of public pressure in that reform versus actual changes to the regulatory scheme? Is there good overlap there when you have public outcry? Is that helpful? Or are we really talking about things that are so technical that it really has to be dealt with in a much more thorough and thoughtful manner?
I think ultimately you have to have systematic reform. So already drug makers charge an arm and a leg for a drug and then set up little charitable funds to help out particular patients that are strapped. So they price discriminate. They charge through the nose when they can, and then they ease those prices for PR benefits, but not nearly enough. So I think this kind of case-by-case public pressure can, at the margins, push companies away from doing things especially egregious. but there's kind of a baseline of egregiousness now that's the industry norm, and to lower that baseline is going to take policy change. And to that end, I think public pressure, in not just public pressure for just one-off individual company actions, but public pressure for policy change is absolutely vital, because the industry, the drug industry, is one of the most powerful lobbies in Washington. It exerts its power, without hesitation and without remorse. And so, and it has an overall, even if it's scandal plagued at the margins, still it has this very positive image. We are the guys that save everybody's lives by coming up with these life-saving medicines. So get off our backs, or you're going to die. So that's a potent threat. And if these people that produce all the pills that keep us alive tell us, if you change this law, we're not going to get any more of these new pills anymore. That's terrifying to legislators who are risk averse and don't want to pass a policy change that then ends up killing the goose that laid the golden eggs. So, so if just the industry voices are dominating the policy debate, as they have for some time, then you're going to end up with very lopsided policy. So the only way to get to more balance is some kind of countervailing power, and public outcry about affordability is the most potent source of countervailing power we have.
Yeah, this, of course, is not to downplay public outcry in the drug pricing debate. ACT UP, although related to, but not to, not exclusive to the patent system, that was an extremely effective political movement. But there is only so much bandwidth the public can have. Perhaps you're a very small population of people with a relatively rare disease that are paying through the nose, but it'll just never gain traction. Perhaps for a relatively small disease, another Tiger King will come out, and people just don't have the attention span and bandwidth to pay out. That actually is what happened with the remdesivir orphan drug status that came out around the same time. But this public pressure, I think, can be channeled not just to, we're going to scrutinize individual companies and make sure they behave and act within accordance of the Patent Act, but also to push for systemic reforms. As Brink said, the pharmaceutical companies, rightly have the ability to say, we're the ones who bring to market innovations that save lives, extend lives. That's absolutely true, and they deserve that credit. But a more critical examination of the patent system specifically, I think, would be a great way to channel those public benefits. Because as we said, pharmaceuticals are the best case for the patent system, but even then there are some instances where socially desirable innovations simply won't be produced, never mind the fact that the grants of exclusivity can lead to excess profits far beyond what a reasonable patent holder would do. So I think channeling that into broader reform, not just for the patent system specifically, but to make up for the gap for any innovations that could be lost through patent reform, though I'm skeptical. I think we're well into the excess territory for patent rights that are granted, but to channel that into a more critical analysis of the system more broadly would be valuable. Though, it must be said, Gilead did back down, so that's not to say it can't work, but it should be channeled into much broader systemic reform.
Well, thank you both, Brink and Daniel. Oh, it looks like we have one more question. Do we have any new research and writings coming out on these issues, or is what we've already produced currently available on the Niskanen site?
What we've produced is on the Niskanen site. We, in addition to the niskanenscenter.org site, we have capturedeconomy.com, which Dan runs and can talk a little bit more about. But in addition to regular updates on policy developments in the intellectual property space, we also have this wonderful reference library where every major study on intellectual property, on patent policy and copyright policy, we digest and put in our system. So if you're looking to educate yourself on any of the policy issues in the what we call the captured economy space, capturedeconomy.com is one-stop shopping for figuring out the best that has been written and thought on these topics today.
Yes, so I manage the website, and so in addition to providing just regular updates on what's going on in policy world and things like that, we publish longer pieces, blog post, op-ed things discussing some of the more recent developments in the debate I've written about, things I've discussed in terms of the role of the pharmaceutical industry in drug pricing and the pros and cons of all of that. We're also keeping track of developments in obviously treatments for coronavirus, but more specifically how that is financed, how we can improve that financing, and what ways we can more critically examine the costs and benefits of the patent system and look for alternatives to it. We have Andrew Weiss. Can you repeat the name? Oh, yes, that's the Bayh-Dole Act. B-A-Y-H or H-Y, and then Dole. It's Evan Bayh and Bob Dole, and it was passed in 1980. And the specific provision I referenced was march-in rights.
I'll correct my younger colleague. It was Evan Bayh's dad, Birch.
My mistake then. But yes, Bayh-Dole.
I was going to say, I didn't think Evan Bayh was quite that old.
Oh dear, silly me.
Dynastic politics at their finest.
Yeah.
So thank you both to Brink and Daniel for your thoughtful commentary today. Thank you for all our attendees and such great questions. A copy of this webinar will be available. And also I encourage you to go to niskanenCenter.org for further research, and also to the capturedeconomy.com. And again, if you have any further questions or questions we weren't able to get to in this time frame, please don't hesitate to reach out. Our contact information is available at the Niskanen Center website. Thanks everyone, and stay safe.
Take care.